The Battle of the Spanish Armada. It's one of the most iconic moments in history where the mighty Spanish fleet, considered the most powerful in the world at the time, was utterly shattered by a small, daring nation led by the English. This wasn't just a naval conflict. This was a clash of empires, a defining moment in the struggle for dominance over the seas. But what really happened? What did this moment mean, not only for Spain but for the entire world? Picture this. It's 1588, and King Philip II of Spain, the most powerful ruler in Europe, has sent his invincible armada to invade England, an island nation that dares defy Spain's imperial might. The plan is clear. England must fall. The Spanish fleet, with its massive warships, overwhelming numbers, and the reputation of Spanish naval dominance, seems like an unstoppable force. A force so powerful that it's believed to be the final step in securing Philip II's control over the seas. Nothing could stand in its way. Or so they thought, but on the fateful day when the battle began, something unexpected happened. The winds shifted. The smaller English fleet, led by Sir Francis Drake, capitalized on the shifting tides, forcing the Armada into a battle it was unprepared for. Storms raged, fierce winds pushed the mighty Spanish ships off course, and the English used their speed and maneuverability to devastate the Spanish fleet. It was a catastrophe of monumental proportions, but here's the truly shocking twist. The cost of the Armada's failure wasn't just the loss of ships and lives. No, this was the beginning of a psychological unraveling of the Spanish Empire itself. This defeat, this humiliation, sent shockwaves through Europe. Spain, once untouchable in its dominance, now had a crack in its armor. The once feared empire, led by a king who had believed in its invincibility, was now seen as vulnerable. For centuries, Spain had been the epitome of naval power, its fleets cutting through the oceans like blades. But after the Armada's defeat, everything changed. What happened next is nothing short of revolutionary. Other European nations, seeing Spain's vulnerability, suddenly saw an opportunity. The Netherlands, long under Spanish control, began to rise up. What had been a flickering rebellion became a full-blown revolt, and the Dutch, inspired by the failure of the Armada, began to wage a successful war for independence, a war that would eventually lead to the formation of a new and powerful force in Europe. The world was changing, and it was happening right before Spain's eyes. It was the beginning of the end for Spain's reign of dominance. The seeds of a new empire were being sown, and they were sprouting from the very soil that Spain had once believed it controlled. But the psychological blow was not just felt in the Netherlands. Across Europe, Spain's failure in the Armada became a symbol of defeat and fragility. It wasn't just a loss in battle, it was the death of an idea. Spain had been the face of unassailable power, but now the mask had been ripped off. The fear that Spain had instilled in its enemies was replaced with boldness. It was a game changer, a world-shifting event that would shape the course of European and world history for centuries to come. This moment wasn't just about fleets clashing in the sea. It was about the undercurrent of ambition, ego, and power that flows through all great empires. It was about what happens when that power is challenged and when it crumbles. The psychological impact of this defeat would resonate through generations, influencing political decisions, rebellions, and the rise of new world powers. And now, let me ask you, what do you think happened next? How did Spain recover from such a blow to its pride, its military, and its empire? More importantly, what lessons can we learn from this moment in history? How does it speak to the rise and fall of empires in our modern world? Before I dive deeper into how this monumental event changed the course of history, I'd like to take a moment and ask you to subscribe to this channel. Your support gives me the motivation to continue bringing you these deep dives into history. If you've found the story of the Spanish Armada as fascinating as I do, then hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more riveting content. Because understanding history isn't just about the past, it's about learning the lessons of those who came before us and using those lessons to shape the world we live in today. So, let's continue this journey together. The Battle of the Spanish Armada is not just a footnote in history, it's the stuff of legends. It is a symbol of the stark difference between unchecked arrogance and the unpredictable tides of fate. It's a reminder of how the strongest forces, when overconfident or unaware of their vulnerabilities, can be undone by the smallest of factors. It's also an example of the profound psychological impact a defeat can have, not just on an empire, but on the collective psyche of an entire world. What strikes me most about the Armada's failure is the depth of the lesson it carries. Spain, in 1588, was at the height of its power. Philip II's ambition knew no bounds, and his plans for global domination were carried out with meticulous care. The Spanish fleet was not just a collection of ships, it was the embodiment of imperial might. Spain had controlled much of the world's wealth, territories, and influence. They were untouchable. The Armada was the crowning jewel of this power, designed to crush the English heretics and bring England firmly under Spanish rule. And yet, despite all the might, all the resources, and the seemingly invincible reputation, Spain faltered. In those fateful days, the winds didn't just shift, they blew away centuries of Spain's untouchable dominance. There's a lesson there that resonates deeply with me: the power of overconfidence and complacency. Spain, in its immense power, failed to foresee the fragility that exists beneath any empire, no matter how formidable it may seem. They believed they could control the seas, that nothing could rival their naval supremacy. But nature and the courage of a smaller, more agile force proved them wrong. In our own lives, we sometimes find ourselves in situations where we feel invincible. Perhaps it's when we've achieved success, or when we've reached a point of comfort, we begin to believe that nothing can break us, that we are above the challenges that once seemed insurmountable. But much like the Spanish Armada, our greatest weaknesses may be hidden beneath our perceived strength. The arrogance of believing that no one and nothing can challenge us can be the very thing that brings us down. It's not about the size of the force, but the nature of our response to adversity that truly matters. Spain underestimated the unpredictable nature of life and paid the price. The psychological blow that followed the defeat of the Armada was profound. In that moment, Spain's reputation crumbled, and so did its empire's perceived invincibility. The world watched as this once dominant power was dethroned by a smaller nation. This shattered the illusion of infallibility that Spain had projected for years, and the ripple effects were felt across Europe. Spain's defeat didn't just affect its military, it destroyed its prestige. For decades, Spanish power had been synonymous with superiority. Everyone feared the empire, everyone bowed to its might. But that fear was gone in an instant, replaced by the courage of those who had once been submissive to Spain's rule. The lesson here is profound. Never underestimate the power of perception and reputation. What we see here is the power of psychology in shaping the world's events. Spain, for all its might, was not just defeated by cannonballs or storms, but by a shift in the very way the world perceived it. Spain's defeat made the once subjugated nations bold, and from that boldness came the birth of new powers. The Netherlands seized the moment to rise up, and other nations, inspired by this shift, began to challenge Spain's imperial reach. That moment in 1588 didn't just mark a military defeat, it marked the beginning of the decline of the Spanish Empire. The rise of new powers, from the Netherlands to England, is a testament to the truth that every empire, no matter how mighty, will eventually face its fall if it doesn't recognize its vulnerabilities. From a personal perspective, the psychological impact of the Armada's failure is something I can relate to in my own life. We all face challenges where we feel like we're on top of the world, success at work, in relationships, or in personal endeavors. It's easy to feel like we're invincible in those moments, but we must always be mindful of the fragility that exists within all of us. Much like the Spanish fleet, when we feel invincible, we become blind to the smaller forces that may one day undo us. This story serves as a reminder to remain humble in our victories and to always be aware of the winds that can change course at any moment. The collapse of Spain's reputation also brings us to a key lesson about failure. Spain was a great power, but it was undone by what seems like a series of small, almost trivial factors: a change in the weather, the courage of a smaller force, and the ability to adapt quickly. In our own journeys, we will face moments of failure. They are inevitable, but we must understand that failure is not the end, it is in fact, often the beginning of something new. The defeat of the Armada didn't end Spain's influence in the world, but it did set the stage for a shift in the balance of power. Sometimes, the greatest transformations come from our lowest points. The defeat of the Armada and its aftermath serve as a powerful reminder of how quickly fortunes can change. What was once seen as the mightiest empire on earth was humbled by a smaller, more nimble opponent. It's a reminder that no matter how strong we think we are, there's always room for growth, for humility, and for resilience. Failure, when viewed correctly, can be a stepping stone to greater things. And when you look at the entire world history in the aftermath of the Armada's defeat, it's clear that single event helped shape the course of the next several centuries. The defeat sent ripples across the globe. Other powers began to rise, and Spain, once an unstoppable force, began its slow decline. The world as we know it today, with its many power structures and nations, was influenced in part by this one event. It teaches us that no matter how mighty, no matter how unstoppable we may seem, the world around us can change in an instant, and we must be ready to adapt, to grow, and to learn from every defeat. So, as we look back at the defeat of the Spanish Armada, let's remember this. The most powerful forces are often those that know their weaknesses. It's the courage to adapt, to learn from mistakes, and to rise again that defines greatness. The rise and fall of Spain's Armada is not just a story of naval warfare, it's a story of ambition, ego, humility, and ultimately, the understanding that no empire, no matter how strong, is invincible. And let's not forget the lesson from this defeat, how it was not just the fall of an empire, but the birth of new nations, new powers, and the dawn of a new era. Just as Spain's defeat changed the course of history, we too can change the course of our own lives, no matter how big or small. We are all capable of rising from our failures, just as England rose from the ashes of the Armada. The question is, are we ready to face our own storms, to rise when the winds shift, and to learn from the moments when we're brought to our knees? This is the power of history, the power of reflection. History is not just about the past, it's about the present and the future. Let's take these lessons, these stories, and apply them to our lives today. The Armada's defeat was just the beginning. What will your story be? Before we dive deeper into how this event shaped the course of the world, I invite you to join me on this journey. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. Your support means the world and helps fuel more stories that bring history to life. Together, we can explore the events that shaped our world and learn from them. Hit that subscribe button, and let's continue this fascinating journey. In the aftermath of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, the psychological shockwaves that rippled through Europe were nothing short of monumental. This was not just a military failure, it was a crisis of identity for Spain, a country that had once ruled the seas with seemingly unchallenged authority. The Armada's defeat marked the beginning of the unraveling of Spain's global dominance, a slow, agonizing process that would last for centuries. Yet, for the nations witnessing Spain's collapse, it became a symbol of hope, a rallying point for all those who sought to break free from the iron grip of imperial control. For years, Spain had been the undisputed power in Europe, its military, its wealth, and its sprawling empire, intimidating to any would-be challengers. Its influence stretched from the Americas to Europe, from Africa to the Far East. But when King Philip II sent the Armada to invade England, it was the first real challenge to this dominance. In a twisted way, the Armada's failure represented the death of the very idea that Spain had built its empire upon the idea that it was invincible. That invincibility crumbled in the waters off the coast of England, giving birth to a new era of uncertainty, conflict, and opportunity. What is perhaps most striking is how quickly the psychological landscape shifted. Spain, which had long inspired fear across the world, suddenly became vulnerable. This vulnerability was not only in its military defeat, but in its reputation as a powerful empire. The defeat was devastating because it shattered the illusion of Spain's unassailable strength, and that illusion had been central to its global influence. Once the Armada was lost, it wasn't just ships and men that were destroyed. It was the belief that Spain was unstoppable. The power that once held Europe in awe was suddenly exposed as fragile. and that shift in perception was far more dangerous than the loss of any battle. For the first time in a long while, other nations saw an opening. This failure of the Spanish Armada did not just inspire a military response, it ignited a psychological revolution. The Netherlands, which had long been under Spanish control, saw an opportunity to break free from the iron fist of Philip II. The Dutch revolt, which had been simmering for years, now gained new momentum. The Spanish army, which had once been feared across Europe, was no longer the imposing force it had been. This was not just a matter of tactics or numbers, it was a matter of belief. Spain had been the embodiment of imperial authority, and with the defeat of the Armada, that image crumbled. The Dutch, emboldened by Spain's failure, seized the moment and began their struggle for independence in earnest. What had once been a flickering hope for freedom became a full-fledged revolution. The Netherlands' rebellion against Spain was no longer a far-off dream. It became a realistic possibility, something that was within reach. But the psychological impact of the Armada's defeat didn't end with the Dutch. Across Europe, Spain's failure became a symbol, a stark reminder that even the mightiest empire could be undone. It served as a warning to other nations that no matter how powerful they appeared, they were not invincible. This perception shift was seismic. It gave rise to a new wave of confidence in England, France, and other nations that had long been overshadowed by Spain. No longer was Spain the unquestioned ruler of the seas. Now, its enemies saw the cracks in the foundation and began to strike at them. The psychological effect of this loss was deeper than any physical wound. It was a blow to Spain's very essence. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just a loss in battle, it was a massive blow to the psychological warfare that empires rely on. For centuries, Spain had been the face of power. Its ships had sailed the oceans, its armies had crushed those who dared to oppose it, and its wealth had poured into Europe from its colonies. But after the defeat of the Armada, that image was shattered. Spain's dominance, its power, its fearsome reputation, all of it crumbled in the face of a smaller, more nimble opponent, and that crumbling foundation would have lasting effects. The fall of Spain's invincibility was a signal to other nations that they too could rise up, challenge the mighty, and perhaps even topple the greatest powers of their time. But what makes this moment so profound is not just the military defeat, but the psychological ripple it sent across the world. It's the realization that empires, no matter how powerful, are vulnerable. It's the understanding that when an empire loses the confidence of its people, when it becomes psychologically fractured, its days are numbered. The story of the Spanish Armada is not just one of battle tactics and naval superiority. It's the story of the slow, inevitable erosion of a giant's confidence. And it's a powerful reminder that no matter how invincible we feel, there are always forces we cannot control, always vulnerabilities we must be aware of. Reflecting on this, it's impossible not to see the parallels in our own lives. Just like Spain, we often build up our own sense of invincibility. We become comfortable in our success, in our status, in our power, and then, when something shifts, whether it's an unexpected challenge, a failure, or even just the passage of time, we find ourselves exposed. We feel the weight of doubt creeping in, and the confidence we once had begins to slip away. The defeat of the Spanish Armada is not just a historical lesson, it's a personal one. It's a reminder that we must always stay humble, stay vigilant, and never let ourselves believe that we are beyond failure. Every empire, every person, has its vulnerabilities, and it is those who recognize their weaknesses and adapt who truly survive and thrive. In Spain's case, the aftermath of the Armada's failure would be long and painful. But it wasn't just Spain that was affected, it was the entire world. The psychological impact of the defeat rippled outward, changing the course of history. The Dutch, inspired by Spain's fall, began their rise. England, seeing an opportunity to expand its influence, did just that, and the balance of power in Europe began to shift, slowly but surely, away from Spain and toward new rising powers. The defeat of the Armada was the beginning of the end for Spain's dominance, but it was also the start of a new chapter for Europe and the world. This shift is what fascinates me about history. The psychological consequences of a single event, An event that may seem small in the grand scheme of things can change the course of entire nations and even civilizations. The defeat of the Spanish Armada wasn't just a military loss, it was a psychological turning point. It showed the world that even the mightiest empire could fall, that confidence could be shattered, and that opportunities for others could arise in the wake of that fall. The deeper lesson for me and for all of us is that the true strength of a nation, an empire, or even a person lies not in their size, their wealth, or their apparent power, but in their ability to adapt, to learn from mistakes, and to evolve. Spain's inability to adapt, to learn from its mistakes, is what ultimately led to its downfall. And that is a lesson we should all take to heart. Because in our own lives, when we face failure, when we face doubt, it's not the failure that defines us, it's how we respond to it, how we adapt, and how we learn from the challenges we face. The story of the Armada is a powerful reminder of that. So, as we reflect on this incredible moment in history, let us remember that empires, no matter how mighty, are built on fragile foundations. Spain's failure in the Armada wasn't just the loss of a battle, it was the loss of an empire's psychological power. And in that, there is a lesson for all of us. That lesson is this: stay humble, stay aware of your vulnerabilities, and never stop learning. Because the moment we think we are invincible is the moment we become vulnerable. As I reflect on the profound lessons from the defeat of the Spanish Armada, it's hard not to see the lasting impact this moment in history has on our own lives. It's more than just the downfall of an empire. It's a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities and imperfections we all carry. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just a historical event, it was a powerful metaphor for life itself. When I think about the psychological blow that Spain suffered after the Armada's failure, I can't help but feel a sense of understanding. In many ways, we all go through similar experiences. How many times have we, as individuals, placed ourselves on pedestals, thinking that nothing could touch us, that nothing could break us? The Spanish Empire had been that pedestal, towering above the rest of the world, its power seemingly insurmountable. But what happens when that pedestal crumbles? What happens when the confidence you've placed in your own abilities, your own power, your own invincibility falters? It's a jarring realization, one that forces us to face not just external challenges, but our own internal fears and vulnerabilities. Spain's downfall from the defeat of the Armada teaches us a crucial lesson. There's no shame in vulnerability. In fact, vulnerability is the birthplace of strength. The Spanish Empire had long embraced its perceived invincibility, and in doing so, it neglected the reality that no empire, no matter how mighty, can sustain itself forever without evolution, adaptation, and humility. It's a lesson that transcends historical narratives. In our own lives, we often carry the weight of our own successes, thinking we have it all figured out, only to be confronted by life's unpredictable storms. Just like Spain, we may find ourselves in situations where we realize that the pedestal we've built for ourselves is not as solid as we thought. Yet, the true beauty in this moment of downfall is not the defeat itself, but the opportunity that arises from it. When we are knocked down, when we face a failure, there is always an opportunity to rise again, stronger and more resilient. The Dutch, witnessing Spain's vulnerability, seized the moment to reclaim their independence. The defeat of the Armada sparked the beginning of their own rise as a power in Europe. What does that tell us? It tells us that no failure is final, that every setback carries with it the seeds of a new beginning. In the midst of Spain's humiliation, the Netherlands saw a chance to thrive, to break free from the chains that once held them down. This is where the personal connection to history becomes so powerful. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was not just a loss for Spain, it was a lesson for us all about resilience and the power of perspective. The psychological impact of the defeat was so immense because it shook Spain's sense of identity. Spain had defined itself as the strongest, the most powerful, the most invincible. But when that identity was shattered, it didn't just break the empire. It forced Spain to reevaluate who it was, what it stood for, and how it would adapt to the changing tides of the world. In our own lives, when we face challenges, setbacks, or failures, we are often confronted with similar crises of identity. Who are we when we are no longer at the top? Who are we when things don't go as planned? It's in those moments of vulnerability that we are given the chance to redefine ourselves, to adapt, to evolve. Just as Spain's failure allowed other nations to rise, so too can our failures provide opportunities for growth, transformation, and renewal. However, the lesson here is not just about bouncing back, it's about how we respond to the psychological shifts that failure brings. It's easy to fall into despair when things go wrong. It's easy to look at our setbacks as signs that we are weak, that we have lost. But the true strength comes from how we choose to respond. Will we let our failures define us, or will we use them as stepping stones to a stronger version of ourselves? The Spanish Empire, after the defeat of the Armada, had the option to rebuild, to learn, and to adapt. It was not the defeat itself that sealed Spain's fate, it was the failure to adapt, the refusal to learn from the experience, and the inability to shift its identity to meet the demands of a changing world. In our personal lives, this is the crux of the matter: adaptation. We often get caught up in the idea of what success should look like, in the idea of invincibility, of perfection. But true strength lies in the ability to adapt, to learn, and to evolve in the face of adversity. The Spanish Empire failed because it could not evolve. The great empires that followed Spain's downfall, like the British Empire and the Dutch, thrived not because they were without faults or failures, but because they were able to adapt to new circumstances, to learn from the mistakes of those who came before them. As I reflect on the fall of Spain, I realize that each of us carries a little piece of that story. We all have our own invincibility complexes, our own moments where we think we are untouchable, that nothing can bring us down. But life is unpredictable. It throws us curveballs, challenges us in ways we never expected. And when that happens, it's not about the failure itself, it's about what we do with it. Will we let it break us, or will we use it to become stronger, wiser, and more resilient? The defeat of the Armada offers a powerful message to all of us. Never take your power for granted, never assume that success is permanent, and never stop learning. The real strength of an empire, of a person, lies not in their unchallenged power, but in their ability to adapt, to rise again when knocked down, and to learn from their mistakes. The lesson from the Spanish Armada is that invincibility is an illusion, but resilience, adaptability, and the ability to learn from failure, that's where true strength lies. So as we look back at history, let's take the lessons of the Spanish Armada to heart. When the winds of change shift, when we face setbacks and failures, we must remember that this is not the end. It's just the beginning of a new chapter. And in that chapter, we have the opportunity to rise again, stronger than before. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 reverberated far beyond the immediate military consequences. It set in motion a deep psychological shift that would impact not just Spain, but the entire geopolitical landscape of Europe. For centuries, Spain had been seen as the dominant imperial power in Europe, its naval fleet feared by all. The defeat shattered this perception and sowed the seeds of doubt in Spain's invincibility. More than just the loss of ships and men, it was the loss of Spain's sense of its own power and superiority, a loss that would linger and haunt the empire for years to come. At the heart of Spain's failure was not only its military missteps, but its inability to adapt to the changing dynamics of naval warfare. The Armada, which was meant to be an overwhelming force that would crush England's resistance and assert Spain's dominance, was built on a model of power that no longer held sway. The very thing that had made Spain so feared its overwhelming size and strength became its weakness. The Spanish fleet, large and unwieldy, struggled against the more nimble, faster English ships. The battle at sea was not just one of tactics and technology, it was a battle of adaptability, of learning to evolve with the times, and Spain's failure in that respect would have long-lasting repercussions. What struck me most about the aftermath of the Armada's defeat was not just the military humiliation, but the psychological unravelling that ensued. It's easy to think of history as a series of events driven by political or military forces, but in reality, it's the psychological and emotional forces that drive change. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just about losing a battle, it was the moment when Spain's empire began to crack, and it sent shockwaves across Europe. The psychological damage to Spain's pride and reputation was far deeper than the loss of ships could ever be. Spain had long been the embodiment of strength and invincibility. For decades, it had been the undisputed master of the seas, its empire stretching across vast territories in the Americas and Europe. Its gold fleets, rich with treasures from the New World, flowed into Spain, fueling its dominance. The Spanish crown had become synonymous with wealth, power, and most importantly, fear. Its empire was seen as untouchable, its enemies cowering at the might of the Spanish military. But when the Spanish Armada was defeated, that carefully constructed image of invincibility was shattered. Spain was no longer seen as the almighty empire, and that shift in perception would change the course of history. The psychological effect of this loss was not limited to Spain. Across Europe, the defeat became a rallying cry for all those who had suffered under Spain's rule. For the Netherlands, long under Spanish control, the loss of the Armada was a moment of liberation. The Dutch revolt, which had been simmering for years, suddenly gained new momentum. Spain, once feared and unassailable, was now vulnerable, and the Dutch seized upon this newfound weakness. They saw the possibility of a future free from Spanish oppression. What had once been a distant hope for independence was now an achievable goal, a real prospect. In England, the psychological impact of the Armada's defeat was equally profound. The victory was not just a military triumph, it was a moment of national pride and identity. For centuries, England had been threatened by the might of Spain, its naval power and imperial ambitions casting a long shadow over the English crown. But when the Armada was destroyed, England not only secured its own survival, but also proved to the world that it could stand up to the greatest empire of its time. The victory gave birth to a sense of national confidence that would fuel England's rise as a maritime power in the coming centuries. It was the spark that ignited England's future as the preeminent naval force in the world. As I reflect on these events, it becomes clear that the defeat of the Spanish Armada was not just a turning point in military history, it was a turning point in the psychology of empire. The collapse of Spain's invincibility wasn't just the loss of a battle, it was the loss of an idea, a belief system that had underpinned Spain's entire existence as a world power. And it wasn't just Spain that suffered from this collapse, it was the entire imperial system that had been built upon the notion of absolute power. The failure of the Armada marked the beginning of the end of the old imperial order, and it gave rise to a new world order where power was no longer concentrated in one nation. It was the start of the rise of new powers first, England, then the Netherlands, and later France. The psychological fallout of this loss speaks volumes about the fragility of empires. It's easy to think of empires as invincible, as untouchable forces that will dominate the world forever. But the defeat of the Armada shows that even the greatest of empires are vulnerable. Power, no matter how seemingly unassailable, is always in flux, always subject to change. It is not enough to simply hold on to power. Empires must constantly adapt, evolve, and learn. Spain failed to do this, and its empire was slowly chipped away in the years that followed. But there is an important lesson here, one that applies not just to nations, but to individuals as well. The defeat of the Armada was not just a military loss, it was a wake-up call. It showed that no one, no matter how powerful, is invincible. The Spanish Empire's downfall wasn't due to the loss of ships or soldiers, it was due to its inability to adapt and learn from its mistakes. And that is a lesson that we all can take to heart in our personal lives. We often build up our own sense of invincibility, thinking that nothing can bring us down. But when we face failure, when we are knocked off our pedestal, how do we respond? Do we allow our failure to define us, or do we learn from it, adapt, and come back stronger? The defeat of the Armada is a reminder that empires and individuals are vulnerable. It is not the power or wealth that defines strength, it is the ability to adapt, to evolve, and to learn from failure. Spain's inability to change, to recognize its own weaknesses, ultimately led to its downfall. And in our own lives, when we face challenges, we must remember that it is not the setback that defines us, but how we respond to it. As we look back on the defeat of the Spanish Armada, we are reminded that the collapse of empires is inevitable. No empire lasts forever. Whether it's Spain or the United States or any other power, history shows us that all empires eventually crumble. But what remains is the resilience of the people, the ability to rise again, and the lessons learned from those who came before us. The defeat of the Armada was not the end of the world. It was the beginning of a new chapter in history, one that was shaped by the psychological shift that it caused. And that shift, both for Spain and for the world, continues to influence us today. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is an event that transcends mere military history. It is a deeply personal lesson, one that resonates with all of us on a human level, not just as a nation or a historical incident. This failure, while devastating for Spain, holds profound significance for individuals, for societies, and for empires. It serves as a reminder that no matter how powerful or invincible we may seem in the moment, our foundations, our confidence, our strength, and our resilience are vulnerable. It is a powerful call to introspection, urging us to examine the fragility of our own sense of invincibility and the importance of continual growth and adaptation. I find it fascinating how, throughout history, empires rise and fall. The Spanish Empire, once the greatest power on earth, built upon wealth, might, and prestige, seemed unshakable. But the Armada's defeat exposed the reality that even the most formidable empire can be reduced to a shell of itself when it fails to adapt to changing circumstances. There's something so human about that, our tendency to overestimate our strength, to become complacent in our successes, and to believe that the rules of life will never change. The Spanish Armada didn't just symbolize the loss of a battle, it was the symbolic cracking of an empire's ego. A pride so deeply rooted in invincibility was destroyed by the shifting tides and the tactical brilliance of a smaller, more agile opponent. From a personal perspective, I can't help but draw parallels between Spain's defeat and the challenges that we face in our lives. We all experience moments when we're at the peak, when everything seems to be going in our favor and the world seems to bend to our will. But what happens when that sense of control slips? What happens when we face a failure so great that it rattles the very foundations of who we are? How do we respond to the winds of change that threaten to take us off course? This is where the true value of the Armada's defeat lies. It's a reminder that the strength of an empire, a person, or a community is not just in its immediate power, but in its ability to learn, adapt, and evolve. Spain's downfall was not a consequence of having too little power, but of failing to evolve with the times, of believing that the strategies of the past would forever remain effective. It was a reminder that success, whether personal or professional, is not a static state. It requires constant growth. For individuals, this is a crucial lesson. We cannot rest on our laurels. We must remain humble in our achievements and always be prepared for change, for challenges that will inevitably come. There is also a deeply emotional element to Spain's loss, one that I believe resonates with anyone who has ever suffered a blow to their pride or sense of self. The psychological devastation that Spain experienced was not just about the military defeat. It was about the loss of a belief system. For centuries, Spain had been the face of global power. Its wealth and naval dominance were symbols of its supremacy. But when that belief was shattered, it left behind a sense of vulnerability. It's hard not to sympathize with that feeling, the terror of losing everything you once held certain, of seeing your carefully crafted identity crumble in the face of an unforeseen challenge. What the defeat of the Armada teaches us is that empires, like people, are fragile. They are built on perception, on confidence, and on the ability to inspire fear or awe in others. But what happens when that perception is cracked? When the world stops fearing you and others begin to see that you too are vulnerable? Spain's failure was a reminder that nothing in life is permanent, whether it's power, wealth, or even the respect of others. But there is something profound in that realization. Once we acknowledge that our position in the world is fragile, it opens the door to greater humility, to self-awareness, and to the realization that we can learn and grow from our failures. For me personally, I take away two powerful lessons from the story of the Spanish Armada. The first is that failure is inevitable, but it doesn't have to be permanent. Spain's defeat was catastrophic, but it didn't mark the end of the world. It was the beginning of a new era, a shift in power, a lesson in resilience. The second lesson is that we must always be aware of our own vulnerabilities. No matter how strong we feel in the moment, we must be vigilant in recognizing our weaknesses and ready to evolve. Success is not about maintaining an impenetrable fortress around us. It's about recognizing that sometimes the walls we build can be breached, and when they are, we must be prepared to rebuild, to learn, and to adapt. What happened to Spain in 1588 isn't just history. It's a timeless narrative that speaks to the way we live our lives today. Whether in personal relationships, careers, or ambitions, we all experience moments when we feel invincible, when we believe that nothing can stop us. But life has a way of humbling us, of showing us the cracks in our armor. The challenge then becomes not in avoiding failure, but in how we respond to it. Do we let it define us? Or do we rise from it, stronger, more resilient, and ready for the challenges that lie ahead? As we look back on the fall of the Spanish Armada, it's important to remember that empires and individuals are defined not by their successes, but by their ability to rise after failure. It's a story of transformation, of adaptation, and of the enduring power of resilience. The defeat of the Armada was the beginning of the end for Spain's dominance, but it was also the beginning of something new. It marked the rise of new powers of nations like England and the Netherlands, who saw the fall of Spain not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. And that, I think, is the most important lesson of all, that every loss holds the seed of a new beginning. It's up to us to recognize that seed, nurture it, and use it to grow stronger than we ever were before. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 didn't just mark a significant military loss for Spain, it was the end of an era and the beginning of a long decline that would ultimately lead to the collapse of one of the most powerful empires the world had ever known. What is perhaps most striking about this moment in history is the ripple effect it created, not only reshaping the balance of power in Europe, but also giving birth to new ideas about leadership, resilience, and the nature of power itself. The psychological consequences of the Armada's defeat were far-reaching. It was not just the physical destruction of Spain's mighty fleet, or the loss of thousands of men that mattered most. It was the shattering of Spain's self-image. For decades, Spain had been the dominant naval power, the great empire that commanded respect across Europe and beyond. The Spanish had believed themselves invincible, and the defeat of the Armada struck at the heart of that belief. It was a loss of confidence, an internal fracture that would haunt Spain for generations. What's fascinating about this event, however, is how the defeat of such a powerful empire did not signify the end of Spain's global influence immediately. While the psychological damage to the Spanish Empire was evident, it didn't evaporate overnight. The long-term effects would be more subtle, yet ultimately devastating. Spain's failure to maintain its reputation for invincibility had far-reaching consequences not just for Spain itself, but for the rest of Europe. The defeat of the Armada became a symbol, a lesson, and a catalyst for change, propelling other nations into new positions of power and influence. The loss was so much more than a military setback, it was a wake-up call to Spain and to the world. The defeat of the Armada revealed a critical vulnerability in the Spanish imperial machine. The power that Spain had once wielded so effortlessly, and which had been feared by nations for centuries, was now exposed as fragile. The once mighty empire began to crack from within. It wasn't just the loss of ships that hurt. It was the undermining of Spain's very identity as the unquestioned leader of the seas. For a nation that had prided itself on invincibility, this blow was both devastating and irreversible. What followed was a subtle but crucial shift in the dynamics of power in Europe. The defeat of the Armada didn't just hurt Spain, it sent shockwaves through Europe, leading to a reawakening of ambition in other nations. The immediate effect was felt most dramatically in the Netherlands, which had been under Spanish control for years. For the Dutch, Spain's vulnerability presented an opportunity for independence. The Dutch revolt, which had been simmering for years, gained newfound momentum after the defeat of the Armada. The revolt, which had seemed like a distant dream, now appeared within reach. The psychological blow to Spain was a wake-up call for other nations that had once been too intimidated to challenge the power of the Spanish crown. But the Dutch were not the only ones who saw an opening. Across Europe, Spain's failure became a symbol of hope, a sign that even the mightiest empires could be brought to their knees. For centuries, Spain had been the unquestioned master of the seas, its power unchallenged, but with the defeat of the Armada, a crack appeared in the facade of invincibility, and that crack would only widen in the years to come. The psychological shift wasn't just about military strategy, it was about perception, belief, and confidence. Spain's empire had been built on the idea that it was invulnerable, but once that idea was shattered, everything changed. England, too, felt the psychological impact of the Armada's defeat. For years, England had been under threat from Spain, with the Spanish crown seeing the English as a rebellious thorn in its side. Spain had long been a dominating presence, both in the seas and on land, and its threat loomed large over England's sovereignty. But the defeat of the Armada was a turning point. It not only secured England's survival, but also solidified its position as a rising maritime power. The psychological impact of the victory gave birth to a new sense of national pride and identity in England. For the first time, England had proven itself capable of standing up to the might of Spain, and that newfound confidence would set the stage for England's rise to dominance in the coming centuries. Reflecting on this, I'm struck by how closely the story of the Spanish Armada mirrors the struggles that we all face in life. It's so easy to build a sense of invincibility, to believe that we are untouchable in our successes. Whether in our personal lives or in our professional ambitions, we sometimes think that we have reached the peak, that nothing can bring us down. But just like the mighty Spanish Empire, all of us have vulnerabilities, weaknesses that we may not be able to see until it's too late. The defeat of the Armada is a reminder that no empire, no person is beyond failure. No matter how secure we feel in the moment, life has a way of shaking us up, of showing us that nothing lasts forever. What makes the story of the Spanish Armada so powerful, however, is not just the military failure, it's the lesson that comes from it. The lesson that no matter how strong or invincible we feel, we must always stay humble, always be ready to learn and adapt. The Spanish Empire failed not just because it lost a battle, but because it couldn't adjust to changing times. It was too reliant on its old strategies, too confident in its superiority. It didn't see the winds shifting, and when those winds changed, Spain was left vulnerable. This lesson is one that resonates deeply with me, personally. In our own lives, we often encounter moments when we feel on top of the world. We achieve success, we gain recognition, we believe that we have mastered our world. But it's in these moments that we must remain cautious. Success can be fleeting, and the key to lasting success is adaptability. The ability to learn from our mistakes, to change when necessary, and to continue evolving is what separates those who rise from failure from those who fall into obscurity. Spain's failure was not inevitable. It was a result of its inability to recognize that its way of doing things no longer worked. And the same is true in our own lives. We cannot afford to become complacent, to believe that what has worked in the past will continue to serve us in the future. The defeat of the Armada is not just a lesson in military strategy. It is a powerful reminder of the fragility of power and the importance of humility. When we think we are invincible, we leave ourselves vulnerable. But when we acknowledge our weaknesses, when we accept that failure is a possibility, we open the door to growth and resilience. Spain's downfall wasn't about the loss of ships or the death of men. It was about the loss of its sense of invulnerability, and that is the most dangerous blow of all. As we reflect on the fall of Spain's dominance, we must recognize that the collapse of empires is an inevitable part of history. Spain's decline wasn't sudden, it was gradual, a slow erosion of power that began with the loss of the Armada. But it wasn't just the fall of one empire, it was the rise of others. The defeat of Spain led to the rise of England, the Netherlands, and later France. The psychological ripple effects of that one event shifted the course of history, reshaping the political landscape of Europe and the world. And in that, there is hope. The story of the Armada shows us that no empire is forever, but the strength of the human spirit, the drive to rise again after failure, can lead to new opportunities, new beginnings, and new empires. And just as Spain's fall gave rise to new powers, so too can we, after our own defeats, rise again stronger, more adaptable, and more resilient than before. The defeat of the Spanish Armada may have marked the end of Spain's golden age, but it also signaled the beginning of a new chapter in history, and that is the true power of resilience. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a turning point not just in the annals of history, but in the very idea of power itself. When we look back at this moment, it's easy to see it purely as a military failure, a loss of ships and lives, but the deeper truth is that it was the unraveling of something far more significant. It was the collapse of an empire's belief in its own invincibility, and that's where the true lesson lies. Spain was brought low, not by a force stronger than its own, but by the shift in perception both its own and the world's. The idea of invincibility is intoxicating. It's something we all chase at some point in our lives. We build up defenses around us, be it in our careers, relationships, or even our own self-worth, believing that no force can break us. This feeling of being untouchable, unbreakable, can give us the strength to push forward, to keep fighting, to maintain our place in the world. But as the defeat of the Armada shows us, this belief is dangerous. It's fragile. The moment we convince ourselves that we are beyond failure, we open ourselves up to a reality that is often more difficult to accept than we ever imagined. Spain's inability to see that it was vulnerable, that the world was changing and evolving, led directly to its downfall. This is a lesson that resonates deeply with me. I've had moments in my life when I believed I had everything under control, when I thought nothing could shake me. But those moments, though sweet and full of confidence, also made me blind to the shifts in the world around me. I became complacent, comfortable, and ultimately susceptible to the same pitfalls that brought down the Spanish Empire. When things change, when the winds shift, we must have the flexibility to pivot. We must be willing to evolve, learn from our failures, and adapt to new realities. Spain's inability to do this is what made its failure so devastating. In our personal lives, we often face our own armadas, those moments when everything we've built is challenged. It may not be on the same grand scale, but it's the same principle. We can lose our sense of control, our place in the world, and our own sense of invincibility. It's in those moments that we must be able to tap into our resilience, the ability to rise from the ashes, to adapt, and to learn. We are never truly invincible, and it is our awareness of our vulnerabilities that enables us to grow stronger. Spain's fall also offers a powerful reminder of the cyclical nature of power. Empires rise and fall, and as one falls, another often rises in its place. The defeat of the Armada didn't just mark the decline of Spain, it marked the rise of other nations, other powers. The Dutch began their revolt, England solidified its position as a maritime power, and the seeds for future shifts in the global power structure were sown. In our own lives, the losses we experience, the failures we endure, don't always signal the end. They can signal the beginning of something new. Just as Spain's decline opened the door for other nations to step forward, our failures can create space for new opportunities, new beginnings, and personal transformations. What strikes me the most about the fall of the Spanish Empire is how it reflects the human experience. We all have moments of strength when we feel untouchable. We all have moments of weakness when we realize that nothing lasts forever. The key to surviving those moments lies in how we respond. Do we wallow in defeat, or do we use it as fuel for growth? Do we allow ourselves to crumble under the weight of failure, or do we rise up and rebuild stronger than before? The defeat of the Spanish Armada is a powerful story of resilience, of vulnerability, and of the importance of adaptability. It teaches us that no matter how strong we become, no matter how high we rise, we must always remain vigilant, humble, and willing to change. The world is constantly shifting, and those who are able to adapt to its changes are the ones who survive. Spain's failure was not inevitable, but it was the result of a mindset that failed to recognize the importance of adaptation, and that's something we can all learn from. The lesson of the Spanish Armada is not just about the past. It's about how we live our lives today. It's about understanding that power is not permanent, that success is not guaranteed, and that the world around us will continue to evolve. It's about being aware of our vulnerabilities and staying open to change, learning from our mistakes, and adapting to the realities we face. The fall of Spain reminds us that nothing lasts forever. but it also shows us that the strength to rise again comes from within. We must stay resilient, stay humble, and always keep moving forward. That's the true power of resilience, and it's a lesson that continues to shape the world today. The story of the Spanish Armada is often remembered as one of the most stunning military disasters in history, but its significance extends far beyond the loss of ships or the deaths of sailors. What truly makes the defeat of the Armada such a transformative moment in history is the profound shift in power it set into motion, a psychological rupture that altered the trajectory of not just Spain, but the entire European continent. Spain had been at the height of its imperial power, a force that had dominated the seas for decades. Its treasure fleets brought immense wealth from the New World, and its armies had conquered vast lands, spreading Spanish influence from the Americas to Europe. The Armada was the symbol of Spain's supremacy, an overwhelming display of naval power. King Philip II of Spain believed that with the defeat of England, he could secure Spanish dominance in Europe, ending Protestantism in England and ensuring that the Catholic faith would reign supreme. Yet, despite Spain's military might, despite its wealth and influence, the failure of the Armada marked the beginning of the end of its imperial supremacy. I find it fascinating that Spain's defeat wasn't caused by superior military force or an overwhelming enemy, but rather by a combination of underestimation, miscalculation, and the sheer unpredictability of nature. The failure of the Armada didn't just expose the vulnerability of Spain's military, it exposed the weakness in Spain's perception of itself. The defeat shattered a carefully constructed narrative of invincibility that Spain had built for centuries. For generations, Spain had cultivated a self-image of being the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. But when the Armada was crushed by a smaller, less powerful fleet, and when the winds and storms became as much of an enemy as the English forces, the reality of Spain's fragility became undeniable. It was a blow to their pride, a tear in their sense of self, and the psychological damage was far more severe than any ship lost in the battle. The defeat sent shockwaves not only throughout Spain, but across Europe. In that moment, Spain's dominance seemed suddenly vulnerable, its invincibility stripped away. What struck me most about this shift is the ripple effect it created among other European powers. This wasn't just a military loss, it was a blow to Spain's reputation as the unchallenged ruler of the seas. In Europe, many nations had lived under the shadow of Spanish power for centuries, but with the fall of the Armada, the Spanish threat no longer seemed insurmountable. The myth of Spanish invincibility began to unravel, and other nations began to sense an opportunity. The immediate consequence of the Armada's defeat was felt most keenly in the Netherlands. For years, the Dutch had been struggling under Spanish rule, their lands subjected to heavy taxation and religious persecution. The defeat of the Armada provided the Dutch with hope and a renewed sense of purpose. What had once seemed like an impossible rebellion now appeared achievable. The loss of the Armada not only undermined Spain's military power, but also gave rise to a psychological revolution among the Dutch. They began to see themselves not as subjects to be ruled, but as people capable of challenging the might of the Spanish Empire. They fought with renewed vigour and resolve, their aspirations for independence fueled by the perceived weakness of their oppressors. The psychological damage done to Spain was profound, for in its failure, it inspired a revolution in the Netherlands that would eventually lead to the formation of the Dutch Republic, a new power in Europe. In England, the defeat of the Armada was a defining moment in the nation's history. England, under the leadership of Queen Elizabeth I, had long been threatened by the power of Spain. The Spanish crown had seen England as a rebellious upstart, a nation that dared defy its religious and political authority. For years, Spain had been an omnipresent threat, casting a shadow over English sovereignty. But after the destruction of the Armada, England not only survived, but emerged stronger. It was a moment of national pride, a moment when the English realized that they could stand up to the greatest empire of their time and emerge victorious. This victory imbued England with a new sense of confidence, and it was in the wake of the Armada's defeat that England would rise to become the preeminent maritime power in the world, its navy securing dominance on the high seas for centuries to come. When we step back and reflect on the psychological shift that the defeat of the Armada triggered, we begin to realize the deeper lesson it offers. Empires, nations, and individuals often become victims of their own belief in invincibility. It's easy to become complacent when you're on top, to believe that nothing can bring you down. Spain's downfall teaches us that nothing lasts forever, not even the mightiest empires. The defeat was not just a military loss, it was a revelation that power is fragile and that overconfidence can lead to devastating consequences. This lesson is deeply personal to me. I've often found myself in moments of success, feeling as though I had reached the pinnacle of my capabilities. There are times in life when we think we have it all figured out, when we feel untouchable and secure. But as history shows us, no one is invincible. Life has a way of humbling us, of reminding us that things can change in an instant. The defeat of the Armada is a potent reminder that our own successes, no matter how significant, can lead to complacency if we're not careful. We must remain humble and adaptable, never assuming that the status quo will last forever. The story of the Spanish Armada is not just about one nation's downfall. It is a cautionary tale for all of us. It is a story about the dangers of becoming too comfortable, too confident in our own superiority. It is a lesson in resilience, in the need to learn from failure, and in the importance of staying vigilant. Spain's failure wasn't inevitable, it was the result of an inability to adapt to new realities, to recognize when things had changed. The same is true in our own lives. We must learn to adjust, to grow, and to accept that failure is part of the journey. But it's not the failure that defines us. It's how we rise from it, how we adapt, and how we move forward that matters most. In the broader context of history, the defeat of the Spanish Armada marked the beginning of the end for Spain's dominance. But it also marked the beginning of a new era. It was the birth of a new world order, one in which Spain would no longer be the unquestioned power. The world shifted in ways that would reshape Europe and the global balance of power. And for the nations watching, it was a symbol that no empire, no matter how mighty, is beyond defeat. The lesson is timeless. No matter how invincible we may seem, there are always forces beyond our control, and the key to survival is not just strength, but adaptability. Reflecting on this, I am reminded of the fragility of power. In life, we often build our own empires, whether in our careers, our relationships, or our personal achievements. We work hard to create something strong, something that feels unbreakable. But just like Spain, we must recognize that even the strongest foundations can be shaken. The true strength lies not in the empire itself, but in the ability to adapt, to recognize when things are changing, and to evolve accordingly. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was the death of an idea, the idea that Spain was invincible, but in that death came new life, new opportunities, and the rise of other powers. We too must learn to embrace change and rise stronger from our failures. The defeat of the Armada was not just a defeat for Spain, it was a lesson for the world, one that we all must heed. The story of the Spanish Armada, though long behind us, holds powerful lessons that are still relevant today. In fact, it is the psychological shift that took place after the defeat that resonates most with me. The story of Spain's fall from unchallenged power is not just a tale of military failure, but of the fragility of human pride and how easily an empire's strength can be undone by overconfidence and complacency. The profound realization I've had from this event is that power, no matter how strong, is always temporary. Spain had been untouchable for so long, its dominance so complete, that it became almost impossible to imagine a world in which Spain was no longer the supreme empire. This is the same kind of thinking that can pervade our personal lives. We get used to success, to winning, and we start to believe that our victories define us, that they make us invincible. It's easy to let the past successes shape our expectations for the future, to think that the same strategies will continue to work indefinitely. But like Spain, all of us, individually and as nations, have our vulnerabilities. Spain's downfall wasn't just about the loss of ships or the death of soldiers. It was about the vulnerability that lies in complacency. It's the danger of thinking that what worked in the past will work in the future. The truth is, nothing lasts forever. The defeat of the Armada wasn't just a military loss, it was the shattering of the idea that any empire is beyond reach. It taught the world that even the mightiest can be toppled, not by brute force necessarily, but by their own failure to adapt. This idea is personal to me, as I reflect on how many times in my life I've found myself caught in moments of comfort and success, only to have something unexpected knock me down. Whether in personal growth, career, or relationships, it's all too easy to take your position for granted. When I think about the Armada's defeat, it reminds me that moments of success should never be taken as permanent. I've seen people, including myself at times, think they've reached the peak only to be humbled by a sudden shift. Whether it's a failure, a crisis, or simply the passage of time, the lesson is clear. We must be ready for change. The defeat of the Armada reminds me that life, like history, is full of surprises, many of them unexpected and out of our control. The winds, both literal and metaphorical, can change in an instant. The storm that battered the Armada wasn't just an act of nature, it was the universe's reminder that things can be undone when you least expect it. How often do we become so fixated on what we've built that we ignore the winds of change? Whether it's a new challenge, a shifting environment, or a personal setback, it's critical to remain aware, to be ready to adapt and evolve when necessary. I think of how this can apply to our personal lives. Just as Spain's empire crumbled from within, we too can be torn apart by our own internal flaws. Whether it's an inability to adapt to change, a refusal to see our weaknesses, or the arrogance of assuming we are untouchable. It's easy to become overconfident in the face of success. We believe that we've figured it out, that we've mastered life, but the truth is, success is not permanent unless we remain vigilant and adaptable. The deeper lesson, then, is not that failure is inevitable, but that we must never let success define us to the point where it blinds us to the realities of the world around us. Spain's greatest downfall wasn't the military loss, it was the collapse of its own myth of invincibility. If we allow ourselves to believe that our victories are permanent, we risk becoming stagnant, losing the very essence of what made us successful in the first place. This is a lesson I try to apply every day. Success shouldn't be about holding on to what we've achieved, but rather about learning how to navigate the unexpected, how to evolve with the changing tides. Spain's defeat was a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is immune to failure. For me, this translates into a constant process of reflection and adjustment. If I let myself become too comfortable, I know I risk losing everything I've worked for. In the grand scope of history, the defeat of the Spanish Armada changed the world. It didn't just end Spain's dominance. It opened the door for new powers to rise, for nations to assert themselves in ways they hadn't before. It gave hope to those who had long suffered under imperial rule. The ripple effects of that moment, the psychological shift that followed, were felt across Europe, inspiring revolutions, inspiring new ideologies, and ultimately leading to the reordering of the global balance of power. In the same way, our personal moments of failure or challenge can be the catalysts for growth, if we are willing to embrace them. Failure doesn't define us. It is how we respond to it that shapes our future. When Spain fell, it wasn't just the empire's downfall, it was the beginning of new opportunities for others. And in our own lives, when we face setbacks, we can see them as opportunities to rebuild, to reassess, and to rise again stronger than before. Ultimately, the defeat of the Armada teaches us a profound truth, that no empire is eternal, no success is guaranteed, and that in the face of challenge, the true strength lies in our ability to adapt, to evolve, and to rise again. In the grand cycle of history, what the defeat of the Spanish Armada reveals to me is not just the frailty of power, but the incredible potential that lies in the ability to learn from failure, to shift with the times, and to build something even stronger in the process. And that, I believe, is the true power of resilience. The Spanish Armada's defeat in 1588 stands as one of the most profound moments in world history, not just as a military failure, but as a pivotal moment that altered the course of empire and power dynamics for centuries to come. Yet, what often gets overlooked is the deep, psychological impact that this loss had on Spain, and the ripple effects it sent throughout Europe. Spain's once invincible empire, which had ruled the seas with unparalleled power, was forced to confront the fragility of its dominance. This moment was not only a humbling one for Spain, but it was a spark that lit the fires of change across Europe, shifting the balance of power and inspiring nations to challenge the seemingly unassailable might of the Spanish crown. For decades before the Armada's defeat, Spain had been the unchallenged ruler of the oceans. Its treasure fleets brought immense wealth from the New World, its armies had conquered vast stretches of territory, and its influence had reached from the Americas to the Far East. Spain's imperial dominance had created a carefully crafted image of invulnerability, a belief that no force on earth could withstand its might. Yet, in a single decisive blow, the mighty Spanish fleet was humbled by a much smaller, more nimble force, the English, led by the resourceful and determined Queen Elizabeth I. But it wasn't just the English ships that brought down Spain's armada. It was the unpredictable winds, the storms that tossed the Armada's mighty ships off course, that sealed Spain's fate. The psychological impact of this defeat cannot be overstated. For a nation that had long cultivated a self-image of invincibility, this failure cracked open a deep sense of vulnerability. It wasn't just the physical loss of ships and men, but the sudden shattering of Spain's carefully constructed image of supremacy. Spain had built its empire on the belief that it was invulnerable, untouchable. But when the winds turned against it, and when the English fleet proved to be more adaptable and strategic, Spain's sense of invulnerability was shattered. The loss was a crushing blow to the national psyche, and it would take generations for the Spanish Empire to fully recover if it ever could. This moment, though devastating for Spain, had profound consequences for the rest of Europe. It sparked a chain reaction that would reshape the European geopolitical landscape. For centuries, nations had lived in the shadow of Spanish power, whether through direct rule or through fear of its might. The Spanish Empire had been the very definition of imperial dominance, and it had cast a long shadow over Europe. But with the defeat of the Armada, Spain's power seemed suddenly fragile. For the first time in generations, other European nations began to see an opportunity, a chance to challenge Spain's dominance and assert their own power. The psychological shock of Spain's defeat was felt far beyond its borders. It emboldened nations like England, France, and the Netherlands to reconsider their positions and question Spain's supremacy. It was a wake-up call for Europe, a reminder that even the mightiest of empires could fall. The immediate consequence of Spain's defeat was the renewed hope for independence among the Dutch, who had long suffered under Spanish rule. The Dutch revolt, which had been simmering for years, suddenly gained new momentum. Spain's vulnerability became their rallying cry. What had once seemed like an impossible dream, the dream of independence, suddenly became attainable. The Dutch saw the fall of the Armada as a sign that the Spanish Empire was not invincible, and they seized the moment. The defeat of the Armada gave the Dutch the courage to continue their fight for freedom, and it ultimately led to the formation of the Dutch Republic, one of the most powerful and innovative nations of the 17th century. In England, the defeat of the Armada had a similarly transformative effect. For years, England had lived under the constant threat of Spanish invasion. Spain had seen England as a rebellious nation, a thorn in its side. The Spanish Armada was supposed to be the final step in crushing England's defiance. But when the Armada was destroyed, England not only survived, it triumphed. The psychological impact of this victory was enormous. It gave birth to a new sense of national identity and pride. The English people, who had long lived in fear of Spanish domination, now realized that they could stand up to the might of Spain and win. This victory would lay the foundation for England's rise as a global maritime power in the coming centuries. England's naval dominance, which had once been threatened by the overwhelming power of Spain, would soon become unrivaled. Looking back on this moment, I find myself reflecting on the psychological toll that this defeat had on Spain, and how it speaks to the vulnerabilities we all have as individuals. Spain's downfall was not merely a result of military failure, it was a failure to recognize the changing dynamics of power and the need to adapt to new realities. Spain's defeat shows us that no matter how secure we may feel in our own success, there is always the possibility that our world can be turned upside down. The mighty Spanish Empire, once the undisputed master of the seas, found itself humbled by forces it had underestimated. It had become complacent, believing that its past successes would guarantee its future dominance. But life has a way of reminding us that nothing lasts forever. As I reflect on my own life, I see the lessons of the Armada's defeat reflected in my personal journey. It's easy to feel invincible when things are going well. When we're on top of our game, we become comfortable in our success, thinking that we've figured it all out. But it's in those moments of success that we must remain vigilant, knowing that change is always around the corner. Like Spain, we can become blinded by our own sense of security, forgetting that challenges can arise when we least expect them. The defeat of the Armada reminds me that I must always be ready to adapt, to evolve, and to learn from failure. Complacency is a dangerous thing, and the key to resilience is never assuming that what worked in the past will continue to work in the future. The defeat of the Armada also taught me that failure isn't the end, it's the beginning of something new. For Spain, the loss of the Armada marked the beginning of a slow decline. But for the nations that rose in its wake, England, the Netherlands, France, it was the beginning of new opportunities. The defeat of Spain created a vacuum, a space for new powers to assert themselves. In our own lives, when we face failure or setback, we must see it as a chance to grow, to reassess our strategies, and to rise again stronger than before. Failure is not the end of the story. It's an opportunity to learn, to innovate, and to move forward with renewed strength and purpose. In the grand sweep of history, the defeat of the Spanish Armada was not just a turning point for Spain, it was a turning point for Europe and the world. It marked the end of an era of Spanish dominance and the beginning of a new world order. But it also serves as a powerful reminder of the fragility of power and of the need for humility and adaptability in the face of change. The defeat of the Armada shows us that no empire, no matter how mighty, is immune to failure. It is a lesson we all must remember as we navigate our own lives and careers. In the end, the true power lies not in the size of our empire or the extent of our success, but in our ability to remain humble, to learn from our mistakes, and to adapt to the changing tides of life. This is the lesson of the Spanish Armada, and it's one that continues to shape my understanding of power, resilience, and the fragility of success. The defeat of the Spanish Armada is often seen through the lens of military tactics, historical events, and geopolitical shifts. But if we take a moment to reflect deeper, it becomes clear that this loss was more than just a moment in time. It was a profound lesson in the vulnerabilities that come with power. Power, no matter how vast or long-lasting, has its limits. Spain's empire had been so successful for so long that its leaders truly believed they were invincible. The downfall of the Armada wasn't just the destruction of ships or loss of men. It was the disintegration of the very idea that no one could challenge Spain's might. This is where the lesson of resilience and adaptability becomes so important. Like Spain, we often reach a point in our lives where we feel on top of the world, thinking our success will last forever. I find that this is a trap that many of us fall into, myself included. We grow comfortable, we stop questioning our assumptions, and we assume that the world we've built will endure. It is in those moments that the winds of change can hit hardest, when we least expect them, when our complacency blinds us to the changing tides around us. Spain's defeat showed that even the greatest powers can be taken by surprise by the unforeseen. And that lesson holds true in our personal lives as well. Our careers, our relationships, our goals, nothing is immune to change. The Spanish Armada's failure is also a testament to the importance of evolving with the times. History shows us that nations, like individuals, that resist change can be left behind. Spain had built its empire on naval supremacy, but the world was changing, and their once superior ships became outdated. The world was evolving faster than Spain could adapt. The same is true for us, whether it's in our work, our relationships, or our personal development. If we remain static, if we rely solely on the successes of the past, we risk becoming irrelevant. The ability to pivot, to adapt, and to learn is what separates those who rise from failure from those who stay down. When I think about how the Dutch and English responded to Spain's failure, I'm reminded of how moments of defeat can ignite a spark of motivation in others. For the Dutch, the Armada's defeat meant the possibility of independence. For the English, it wasn't just about military triumph, it was the birth of a new sense of confidence and identity. These nations saw an opportunity in Spain's failure, an opportunity to challenge the status quo and carve out a new path. This, too, is something we can apply to our own lives. When faced with setbacks or failures, we have the choice to let them define us negatively, or we can turn them into opportunities for growth. It's not about the defeat itself, but how we respond to it. The aftermath of failure is often where the greatest growth happens. If we can see it as a chance for reinvention. Personally, the defeat of the Spanish Armada is a story I turn to when I find myself at a crossroads or facing my own setbacks. I often ask myself, what can I learn from this moment of failure? How can I use this challenge as a launching pad for something new? The story of Spain's defeat is not just about military tactics or geopolitics. It's about the psychological impact of failure and how it can reshape entire nations and how it can reshape us as individuals. There is something deeply human about this narrative. We all have our moments when we feel invincible, but it is in our moments of weakness, in our moments of vulnerability, that we often find the courage to grow and evolve. The Spanish Armada is a reminder that success is not permanent, and neither is failure. Life is a constant cycle of ups and downs, of victories and defeats, and the key to resilience lies in how we respond to both. Spain's downfall didn't mark the end of the world, it marked the beginning of a new chapter. The rise of England, the emergence of the Dutch Republic, these were the consequences of Spain's inability to adapt and evolve. And the same can be true for us. Our personal failures can lead to new beginnings, new opportunities, and new chances for growth. But only if we embrace change, learn from our mistakes, and never stop adapting. Reflecting on this, I realize that the most powerful lesson from the defeat of the Armada is not just about empires or nations, it's about the strength of the human spirit. Spain, despite its power, was humbled, but through its failure, new forces emerged. And in our own lives, when we face failure, we, too, have the ability to rise again stronger, wiser, and more adaptable than before. It's easy to focus on the loss, but it's the recovery, the resilience, that truly defines us. We all experience moments when we feel like the winds are against us, when we face challenges that seem insurmountable. But in those moments, we must remember that failure is not the end. The defeat of the Spanish Armada is a powerful reminder that nothing is invincible, not an empire, not a career, and certainly not our own self-image. But even in the face of defeat, there is always room for growth, adaptation, and the rise of new opportunities. And just like the nations that rose in the wake of Spain's failure, we too can find strength in our moments of vulnerability. The key is to learn from the past, to adapt to the changing tides of life, and to rise again. This, ultimately, is the true lesson of the Spanish Armada. It is a lesson of humility, resilience, and the unyielding power of the human spirit. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 remains one of history's most defining moments, not just because of the military failure, but because of the psychological shift it caused, one that reverberated far beyond Spain's borders, shaping the trajectory of European politics, global power dynamics, and the very essence of empire. Spain, once the unchallenged master of the seas, found itself brought low by a smaller, more nimble fleet. This event would set the stage for the decline of an empire that had once seemed invincible. However, the loss wasn't just about the ships or men lost in battle, it was the fracture in Spain's psyche that ultimately proved to be the most damaging. The psychological ripple effect that spread across Europe became a catalyst for new opportunities, new movements, and new identities. Spain had built its empire on the belief that its dominance was unassailable. From the riches flowing in from the Americas to its military might, Spain was not just a country, it was a symbol of global power. The Spanish Empire, under King Philip II, represented not just the physical conquests, but also the belief that no force could challenge its supremacy. It was not just an empire of land and wealth, it was an empire of invincibility. But the defeat of the Armada shattered this myth in an instant. It exposed the fragility of an empire that had believed itself to be untouchable. It's easy to be lulled into a sense of security when success has been achieved for so long. But as the Armada crumbled against the winds and the resolute English navy, Spain was forced to confront the reality that empires, no matter how grand, are vulnerable to failure. What fascinates me most about this moment in history is how the defeat of such a mighty empire didn't simply signify the loss of battle. It represented the beginning of the end for Spain's global supremacy and a dramatic shift in the balance of power in Europe. The psychological effects rippled far beyond Spain's shores. Nations that had been overshadowed by Spanish dominance for centuries suddenly saw an opening. The psychological and strategic vacuum left by the Armada's failure allowed new forces to rise. What's incredible is that this shift wasn't immediate. It took time, but the seeds of change were planted that day, not only on the battlefield, but in the minds of the nations that had been under Spain's shadow for so long. In a way, the defeat of the Armada was the catalyst for the rise of new powers. Spain's weakened state provided the Netherlands with an opportunity to take bold action and assert their independence. For years, the Dutch had suffered under Spanish control, but the loss of the Armada sparked a new sense of hope. What once seemed like an impossible rebellion now seemed possible. The psychological effect of seeing Spain falter gave the Dutch the confidence to continue their fight, and it ultimately led to the establishment of the Dutch Republic, one of the most powerful and innovative nations of the 17th century. But the defeat didn't just embolden the Dutch. It gave birth to a new sense of national pride and identity across Europe. The English, long threatened by Spain's dominance, saw the defeat of the Armada as a symbol of their own potential. England's survival and eventual triumph over Spain helped shape the national identity of the English people and signalled the beginning of England's rise to maritime supremacy. In reflecting on these events, it strikes me how often we, as individuals, find ourselves in positions similar to that of Spain after the defeat. We build our lives, careers, and relationships around the notion that we are invulnerable, that we are impervious to failure. But life has a way of showing us that no success is permanent, and no empire, be it personal, professional, or societal, is truly invincible. The defeat of the Armada is a powerful reminder that failure isn't necessarily a catastrophe. It's a critical turning point. Spain's downfall wasn't inevitable, it was the result of complacency, of failing to recognize when things were changing. I, too, have experienced moments in my own life when I felt untouchable. I've reached points where things were going well, where I had success, security, and comfort. But just like the Spanish Armada, it's in those moments that life can remind us of our vulnerabilities. Our own sense of security can become our greatest weakness if we're not careful. The defeat of the Spanish Armada teaches us that no matter how secure we feel in our success, we must remain vigilant. The winds can shift in an instant, and when they do, our ability to adapt and respond will determine our future. The real lesson from Spain's failure is that we must stay humble, stay aware of our weaknesses, and never assume that we are beyond challenge. The story of the Armada also speaks to the power of resilience. Spain's loss, as monumental as it was, didn't mark the end of Spain as a world power, though it began the slow decline of its dominance. What happened next, how Spain responded, was a testament to the strength and adaptability of a nation in the face of defeat. The Dutch Revolution, the rise of England, and the eventual challenge posed by France all stemmed from this single humbling event. Spain's vulnerability ignited the ambitions of others, but that's not to say that Spain itself didn't learn from its failure. In the face of its own devastation, Spain had the opportunity to rebuild, to reassert itself, and to redefine its place in the world. While the defeat of the Armada marked the end of one era, it also planted the seeds for the evolution of Spain's identity and future. In our personal lives, we too face moments of defeat. It might not be the collapse of an empire, but we all experience setbacks that threaten to break our sense of self. When I reflect on Spain's story, I am reminded that failure is not the end of the road, it's often the beginning of something new. It's in these moments that we must decide how we will respond. Will we let the failure define us, or will we adapt and rise? The defeat of the Spanish Armada offers us a chance to reflect on our own vulnerabilities, to assess how we react in the face of adversity, and to take that lesson forward in our personal growth. The psychological shift that followed the defeat of the Armada teaches us something deeply human. It reminds us that nothing lasts forever. No matter how strong, no matter how secure, all things are subject to change. The key is not to fear that change, but to embrace it and learn from it. Just as Spain had to adapt to the changing landscape of power in Europe, we too must be willing to evolve with the times. The defeat of the Spanish Armada represents a pivotal moment in history, a moment when an empire that had been seen as untouchable was humbled. But more importantly, it is a reminder that we must remain humble, stay vigilant, and understand that no one, not even the greatest empires, are immune to failure. It is only through adaptation, learning from our mistakes, and growing stronger in the face of adversity that we can truly thrive. The story of the Spanish Armada continues to resonate with us today. The defeat was not just a failure for Spain, it was a moment of transformation for the world. It was a turning point in history, a moment that set the stage for the rise of new powers and the reshaping of global dynamics. And as we reflect on it, it is crucial that we take the lessons it offers to heart. Embrace change. Never let success make us complacent. And above all, remember that it is not the failures that define us, but how we rise from them, how we adapt, and how we continue to evolve. As I reflect deeply on the defeat of the Spanish Armada, I am continually struck by how much it mirrors the personal challenges we all face in life. For centuries, Spain's empire had been a symbol of power and invincibility. It had dominated the seas, brought in immense wealth, and influenced the course of global events. But when the winds changed, both literally and figuratively, the mighty Spanish fleet was rendered helpless. This massive shift in power wasn't just about the loss of ships. It was about the dismantling of a belief system, Spain's belief in its own invulnerability. The defeat made it clear that no matter how much we accumulate, how powerful we seem, life has a way of reminding us of our fragility. I've often found myself caught in moments where everything seems perfect, success feels like it's within my grasp, and life is aligned just the way I imagined it. In these moments, the story of the Armada rings particularly true. The confidence that we too are untouchable often blinds us to the unpredictable forces that can change the course of our lives. In these moments, it's easy to become complacent, to rely on our past successes, and forget that life is unpredictable. Just like the Spanish fleet, we often find ourselves in danger of being knocked off course by the shifting winds of change. However, it is not the setbacks that define us, but how we react to them. Spain's failure is not just a tale of a mighty empire crumbling. It is a reflection of the inevitability of change and the importance of resilience. The way Spain, after such a devastating blow, could have either chosen to rebuild its empire or fade away is a deeply personal lesson for us all. The defeat did not end Spain's dominance immediately. Instead, the psychological damage created a long-lasting shift, a wake-up call for the entire world. But Spain, like all of us, was presented with a choice: to wallow in failure or rise again. What I've learned from this historical event is that failure is not final, but rather it is an invitation for transformation. When we face challenges in our lives, whether it's in our careers, relationships, or personal growth, we are given the same choice. The lesson I take from Spain's story is that failure can either trap us in fear and regret, or it can push us to adapt and grow. Much like how Spain's vulnerability opened the door for the rise of other powers like England and the Netherlands, our personal vulnerabilities can open doors for new opportunities. The key is recognizing that failure doesn't define us unless we allow it to. We are all capable of rising again, just as Spain's fall paved the way for new empires to emerge. Spain's journey following the Armada teaches me that it's not the fall that matters, but the ability to rise from it. The true strength of any empire or any individual lies in the ability to adapt and evolve. No one, no empire, can survive without the ability to recognize change and react accordingly. Spain's failure was not an isolated incident. It was a direct result of its inability to see that times had changed. For me, this is a reminder to never rest on the laurels of past achievements. The world, like the tides, is always shifting. The key is to stay alert, to remain humble, and to always be ready to adjust our sails when the winds change. One of the greatest gifts the defeat of the Armada offers us is a deeper understanding of our own strengths and vulnerabilities. It's easy to think that success is permanent, that things will always remain the same, but life has a way of humbling us. The winds that turned against Spain are the same unpredictable forces that shape our own experiences. We never know when we will face a challenge, but we do know that how we respond to it will determine the course of our lives. I think the lesson that resonates most strongly with me is the need for continual self-awareness and growth. Spain's inability to adapt and adjust led to its decline, but the defeat of the Armada didn't signal the end of its story. It was an opportunity for Spain to evolve. I believe that in our own lives, we are constantly given opportunities to evolve, even after our greatest defeats. The challenge is to see failure not as a dead end, but as a pivot point, a moment of reinvention. If Spain had recognized its vulnerability and adapted its strategies, who knows how much longer its empire might have lasted. The story of the Armada reminds me that the most important lesson in life is not about avoiding failure, but how we face it when it inevitably comes. Spain's empire crumbled because it was unable to recognize that its strength was not in its size or wealth, but in its ability to adapt to change. The same is true for us. We can achieve great things, but the real test of strength comes when we face adversity. It is not the failure that matters, but our response to it. In my own life, when I encounter setbacks, I remind myself of the Spanish Armada. I remind myself that setbacks don't define who I am. My ability to rise, to learn, and to adapt is what defines me. In reflecting on the fall of the Spanish Armada, it's clear to me that the story isn't just about Spain. It's about all of us. The defeat was not an isolated historical event. It is a universal reminder that success is fragile, and that resilience comes from the ability to embrace change. Life is full of unexpected twists, and just as the Spanish fleet was humbled by the winds, we too must learn to ride the waves of change. When we face failure, we must ask ourselves not why it happened, but what we will do next. Will we learn, adapt, and grow, or will we succumb to the forces that knocked us down? The defeat of the Armada reminds us that the true power in life lies not in invincibility, but in the strength to rise again after defeat. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is one of those rare historical events that not only defines an era, but also serves as a timeless lesson in the fragility of power and the inevitability of change. It is not just the loss of a battle or the sinking of ships that makes this event so significant. It is the deep psychological shift that it caused, not only within Spain but across Europe, that marks this moment as pivotal in the evolution of global power dynamics. Spain, at the height of its empire, was considered the invincible force of the world. For decades, it dominated the seas, secured immense wealth through its colonies in the Americas, and established itself as a formidable military power. The Spanish Empire had woven a narrative of superiority and invulnerability, and King Philip II's decision to launch the Armada was meant to be the final chapter in Spain's total control over Europe. The Armada, with its fleet of massive ships, was designed to invade England, end the Protestant threat, and solidify Spain's dominance. But what was meant to be the final nail in England's coffin ended up being the beginning of Spain's slow and painful unravelling. What makes the defeat of the Armada so striking is the psychological shock it sent through Spain and the world. Spain had been the very definition of strength and dominance for so long. Its military conquests and immense wealth had created an empire built on the belief that no one could challenge its authority. But the Armada's defeat exposed Spain's vulnerability in a way that no enemy had been able to do before. The Spanish fleet, despite its size and firepower, was no match for the agility and cunning of the English navy, nor could it withstand the unpredictable forces of nature. The winds, the storms, and the weather turned against the Armada, and the defeat was as much a consequence of nature's unpredictability as it was of Spain's miscalculations. The psychological impact of this defeat cannot be overstated. Spain's pride was built on its military and naval superiority, and the loss of the Armada was a blow to its very identity. It wasn't just the physical loss of ships and men that hurt it, it was the loss of Spain's sense of invincibility. For generations, Spain had been revered and feared across the world, but in an instant that image was shattered. The defeat didn't just expose a weakness in Spain's military power, it revealed a deeper fragility. The fragility of the empire's belief in its own invulnerability. The psychological wound inflicted by the defeat would not heal quickly. It would linger, affecting not only Spain's reputation, but its actions for years to come. What is truly fascinating, however, is how this moment of defeat marked the beginning of a new era. The psychological ripple effects of the Armada's loss were felt far beyond Spain's borders. Nations that had once been subject to Spain's dominance saw an opportunity to break free from the shadows of Spanish control. The Netherlands, long under Spanish rule, seized the moment to assert their independence. The Dutch revolt, which had been simmering for years, now gained new momentum. What had once been an impossible rebellion now became a real possibility. The defeat of the Armada gave the Dutch the courage to continue their fight for freedom, ultimately leading to the establishment of the Dutch Republic, one of the most powerful and influential nations of the 17th century. In England, the defeat of the Armada had a similar, though even more profound effect. For years, England had lived in fear of Spanish domination. The Armada was supposed to be the final blow to English sovereignty. But when the English fleet triumphed over the Spanish, it not only secured England's survival, but also propelled the country onto the global stage. The defeat gave birth to a new sense of national pride and identity. England realized that it could stand up to the might of Spain and emerge victorious. This victory would lay the foundation for England's rise as a maritime power, establishing it as the dominant naval force in the world for centuries to come. The defeat of the Spanish Armada speaks to a broader, more universal lesson about the fragility of power and the inevitability of change. For centuries, Spain had believed that its empire would last forever, that its dominance on the seas and its influence across the globe could not be challenged. But the defeat of the Armada exposed the truth. Nothing lasts forever. Even the mightiest of empires can fall, and nothing is guaranteed. The defeat was a reminder that power, no matter how solid it may seem, is always subject to change. The winds of fate are unpredictable, and they can shift in an instant. What I find particularly compelling about this story is how closely it mirrors our own lives. We all experience moments of success where everything seems to be going well. Whether it's in our careers, relationships, or personal lives, we can become comfortable in our success, thinking that we've figured it all out. But just like the Spanish Armada, life has a way of throwing us off course. The winds change, and we find ourselves facing new challenges. The defeat of the Armada is a powerful reminder that nothing is permanent, and that we must remain vigilant, adaptable, and open to change. In my own life, I've often found myself at crossroads, where things were going well, and I felt secure in my achievements. But I've learned that it is precisely in those moments of comfort and success that we must be the most cautious. Success can easily lull us into complacency, making us believe that we're invincible. But the reality is that we all have vulnerabilities, and when we stop acknowledging them, we set ourselves up for failure. The story of the Armada teaches me that the key to lasting success is adaptability. It's about being able to respond to challenges, to adjust to changing circumstances, and to learn from failures. The story of the Armada also teaches us the value of resilience. Spain's defeat didn't mark the end of the empire, but it did mark the beginning of its decline. However, this decline was not the end of the story. The defeat sparked new ambitions, new opportunities, and new possibilities for other nations. The Dutch seized their chance for independence. England emerged as a maritime superpower, and France, too, began to rise in power. The defeat of the Armada, while a catastrophe for Spain, created the space for others to rise. This is a powerful lesson for all of us. Failure is not the end. It is often the beginning of something new. When we face setbacks or challenges, we can either allow ourselves to be defeated by them, or we can use them as stepping stones for growth. Spain's inability to adapt to changing circumstances led to its downfall, but the nations that rose in its wake, England, the Netherlands, and France, showed that even in defeat, there is an opportunity to rebuild and rise stronger than before. The defeat of the Spanish Armada also reminds us of the importance of humility. Spain's downfall was not simply the result of military failure, It was a result of its inability to adapt and recognize its vulnerabilities. The empire's arrogance and overconfidence were its undoing. For me, this is a reminder that humility is one of the most important qualities we can cultivate, both as individuals and as societies. When we recognize our own limitations, we open ourselves to growth and new possibilities. Complacency and overconfidence can blind us to the changing tides of life, but humility allows us to remain grounded and ready to respond to whatever challenges come our way. Looking back at the defeat of the Spanish Armada, I realized that this event wasn't just a turning point for Spain, it was a turning point for the entire world. It marked the beginning of a new world order, one in which no single empire could dominate the seas indefinitely. It was the beginning of the rise of new powers and the start of a more dynamic and competitive geopolitical landscape. The story of the Armada is not just a lesson in military strategy, it's a powerful reminder that all empires, whether personal or political, are fragile, and that the true measure of strength lies not in the ability to dominate, but in the ability to adapt, learn, and rise after defeat. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a moment of transformation. It marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter in history. For Spain, it was a moment of reckoning, a painful realization that nothing lasts forever. For the world, it was a moment of opportunity as new powers emerged in the wake of Spain's fall. And for all of us, it is a lesson in resilience, humility, and the power of adaptation. It teaches us that no matter how invincible we feel, we are all subject to change, and the true measure of our strength lies not in how we fall, but in how we rise again. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 is a powerful reminder that even the most seemingly invincible empires are not immune to failure. What struck me most deeply about this historical event is the psychological shift it triggered, not only for Spain but for the world. Spain had built its empire on a foundation of unquestionable power, but the defeat exposed its vulnerabilities in a way that had never been imagined before. It makes me reflect on my own life and the times I felt invincible when success seemed guaranteed and the future felt assured. But just as Spain's empire was vulnerable to the forces of nature and the changing tides of history, so too are we all susceptible to moments of downfall if we are not vigilant and adaptable. The most profound lesson I draw from this event is that nothing lasts forever. Success, no matter how deeply rooted, is fragile. Spain's belief in its own invincibility was shattered not by the strength of its enemies, but by the circumstances that it couldn't control, be it the storms that wrecked its fleet or the agility of the English navy. Similarly, in our own lives, the unexpected can change everything in an instant. When we believe we've mastered something, whether it's a career, a relationship, or even personal growth, we can easily become complacent. I've experienced moments in my life where success seemed like it would last forever. But life is an unpredictable sea, and it has a way of shifting when we least expect it. Just as the Spanish Armada was swept away by forces beyond its control, we must accept that the uncontrollable elements of life can challenge even the most carefully crafted successes. This realization brings with it both a sense of humility and empowerment. The story of the Armada teaches us that it's not the victory that defines us, it's how we respond to defeat. When we face challenges or failures, we have two choices. We can let them define us, or we can use them as opportunities to rise stronger. The psychological blow to Spain was devastating, but it was also the catalyst for the emergence of new powers, like England and the Netherlands, that seized the opportunity to rise when Spain faltered. In the same way, personal setbacks can be the fertile ground from which we grow. When Spain's empire began to unravel, it opened doors for others to claim power. This tells me that the key to thriving in life is not avoiding failure, but learning from it and having the courage to move forward. I also see in the defeat of the Armada a reminder of the importance of staying adaptable. Spain's inability to adapt to the changing dynamics of warfare and to the unpredictable forces of nature ultimately contributed to its downfall. In my own experiences, I've found that the most important lesson is to remain open to change. The world around us is constantly evolving, and so must we. Whether it's embracing new technology in a career, adapting to personal changes, or accepting that life will inevitably challenge our beliefs and assumptions, we must be willing to evolve. The defeat of the Armada shows that empires, like people, are at their most vulnerable when they refuse to change. There is a lesson in resilience here as well. Spain's decline wasn't immediate, it was gradual. But the defeat of the Armada served as a turning point, a wake-up call that forced Spain to confront its own fragility. What we see in history, and what we can take into our own lives, is that failure doesn't have to be the end. Instead, it can be the beginning of something new. The countries that rose in the wake of Spain's fall were able to use the opportunity to reshape their own destinies. The defeat of the Armada wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of new chapters for England, the Netherlands, and eventually, France. Similarly, our own challenges and failures don't have to define us negatively. If we are willing to rise again, we can write new chapters of our own. As I think about how history shapes the present, the defeat of the Spanish Armada is a perfect example of how moments of crisis often precede moments of growth. Spain's defeat didn't just mark a loss of power, it marked the start of a new era, an era where other nations could claim power for themselves. The story of the Armada is a reminder that nothing is permanent, but rather than feeling defeated by that truth, I find it empowering. The ability to adapt, to learn, and to rise from failure is a lesson that resonates deeply with me. Just as the defeat of the Armada opened doors for others to rise, so too can our failures create the space for us to grow and reinvent ourselves. In my personal journey, the story of the Armada reminds me that challenges, while difficult, are not the end of the road. They are an invitation to adapt, to evolve, and to find new strengths. The defeat of Spain's once mighty fleet shows me that there is no shame in facing setbacks. In fact, they are often the beginning of something much more powerful. When we accept our vulnerabilities and embrace the changes that life brings, we set ourselves on the path toward growth, resilience, and ultimately, greater strength. The defeat of the Spanish Armada, in its grand historical context, is not just a lesson for nations, it's a lesson for all of us, one that encourages us to stay humble, to remain adaptable, and to remember that even in the darkest moments, there is an opportunity to rise again. Thus, the story of the Spanish Armada speaks not only of an empire's fall, but of the enduring human spirit. It's a story of overcoming arrogance, embracing humility, and finding the courage to move forward even when the winds of fortune seem to turn against us. Just as Spain's defeat wasn't the end of its story, neither is failure the end of ours. It's what comes after the resilience, the learning, the growth that truly defines us. And for me, the defeat of the Armada stands as a powerful reminder of the fragile, ever-changing nature of life and the strength we can find in embracing its uncertainties.